Hello, my name is Summer Cohen, and I am the host of Breaking Frum, which is the podcast that you are either listening to or viewing on YouTube. I have been deliberating as to how exactly I wanted to launch this podcast. I was really struggling to figure out what a good first episode would be, just to dip my toe into it. And after some scrolling on YouTube, I stumbled across the topic for today's episode. Before we get into that, I want to, because this is the first episode, give you a little bit of an introduction into Breaking Frum. What is Breaking Frum? What are we going to be talking about here? And also give you a little introduction into who I am, what my story is, and why I wanted to launch such a podcast in the first place. Two very important details. So let's get into that, and then we will get into the topic of today's episode. So to give you a little bit of an introduction into Breaking Frum, we are centering the voices of the various different stories and the various different narratives that come along with being both OTD and with being Frum. If you're unfamiliar with the concept of what it means to be OTD, OTD stands for off the derech. Derech in Hebrew means path or journey, and so it literally translates to off the way. Culturally, in Orthodox environments, this is often used to describe people who, were raised in a certain cultural framework in the Orthodox community and then left and became secular. Or in some cases, depending on the community that you're from, you might have just transitioned to practicing Judaism in a different way, whether that's, you were raised Hasidish and now you're more modern Orthodox, or maybe you joined a conservative or reform synagogue. So whatever that transition of Jewish structure looked like for you, you could also be considered OTD. In media today, there is a certain kind of narrative that I like to refer to as the unorthodoxification of the OTD story. It is a very specific kind of person and a very specific kind of story that is often put on a pedestal. Their stories are often told because they are sensationalist. And that's not to say that they're not true or that they're not real or that they're not valid. They just happen to be more interesting. They can be capitalized off of in media and shows and films. They're to use, language that might be fitting for the entertainment industry. They feel a little more dramatic, which really pulls an audience in, especially when they're already unfamiliar with the world that you're talking about and you're building a story with it. And the truth of the matter is that there are so many different kinds of stories surrounding those of us that have left, what our stories looked like, what happened when we left, why did we leave, did we want to? And then, you also have people within these communities who maybe the way that in which they practice Judaism has changed. So they're not necessarily OTD, but they are straying from the path that was initially set out for them by their parents, which is, in its way, its own hardship and comes with its own difficulties. And I think because it does not fit that very classical narrative of, baby bird sort of breaks out of this cage, those stories aren't centered when we are talking about the ultra-Orthodox Jewish community. And that's what I'm trying to do with this show. I want to give people the platform to be able to talk about their story, the ways in which they experienced leaving that might have felt foreign to them, while absorbing some of this ex ultra Orthodox content, whether that's through media, online, through different kinds of podcasts. So that is what we set out to do. And I guess that might beg the question, why do I want to provide that platform for others? I grew up for the early years of my childhood in a conservadox environment. We were pretty traditional. I would say that I was probably the most religious kid, certainly in my class at my Hebrew school. And I would say our family was more religious than most of the people that went to that school. We did not go to public school. We were pretty sheltered. We went to synagogue every single week. We did Hebrew school and after school events. We did every single holiday. And also, I, grew up in and around Chabad houses throughout those early years as well. So I was very much in the thick of it. But it wasn't until my mother remarried when I was about 10 years old to a very black hat Chabad Lubavitch man that we sort of transitioned from that conservadox kind of environment to a very staunchly frum Orthodox environment. So from, 10 until I decided to leave the community, which we will talk about momentarily, I grew up in a Chabad Lubavitch home. But the community itself was pretty mixed. It wasn't strictly Hasidish. It wasn't, I would say it was predominantly Litvish. Certainly that was the case when I was going to school. But in any case, the transition from conservadoxy to orthodoxy was not a huge stretch for me. I mean, there were some differences, especially surrounding clothing and stricter kosher laws that were a little bit of a jump or a hurdle. But for the most part, it was a pretty smooth transition because, it wasn't like I was particularly secular to begin with. And I really enjoyed that. I enjoyed the structure of it. I enjoyed the spirituality that I got from it. And I have taken a lot of what I grew up around with me as an adult, even after I left. However, when I turned 19, I left the community. Why did I leave the community? I came out as a lesbian at the time because my parents were really pushing for shidduchim at that point, and I couldn't do it. Not because I didn't want to get married eventually, but because I didn't want to be a frum woman getting married to a frum man. And so I raised about $6,500. I got myself a U-Haul, and my best friend came with her car. And I said to my parents, I cannot get married in this world because I am queer and I have to leave. So I subletted an apartment in a different city and I left within 2 weeks. And so that was my exit for the most part from the community. And since then, I have grown a lot. I think I've learned a lot. And I have been able to not only reconnect with a OTD community, but also reconnect with the community that I come from, connecting with other frum people again in a way that is beneficial for me and is healthy for me. And while doing that, while wading through some of these OTD spaces, especially as soon as I moved out, I really realized that there was a need for other OTD people to be able to tell their stories and hear themselves when looking at media. At the time, one of two of the only pieces of media that had come out about, the world that we grew up in was Unorthodox, which aired in 2020, and My Unorthodox Life, which aired in July of 2021. So I left in March of 2021. At that point, literally almost to the day, Unorthodox had been out for 1 year, and My Unorthodox Life went out like 5 or 4 months after I'd been out of the community. So these were really the two major pieces of media that people had to look to, and most people did not feel represented by either of these shows. And, um, when I had left, one of my biggest interests was in film. I really wanted to go into the film industry and be a filmmaker. That's one of my majors now that I'm in college. And that's something that's very close to my heart and something that I've been working on personally. And I really decided that I wanted to be able to help these folks tell their stories in a way that was meaningful to them. And so I think that this podcast hopefully is going to be the start of that. And I think that this is a good segue into really the point of what this video is about, which is that, as I said earlier, I was doing some scrolling through YouTube and I came across this video that was posted about 2 weeks ago called Unorthodox on Netflix, fact-checked by Orthodox Jewish couple. And it was published by Rabbi David Vigler. And in the video, Rabbi Vigler and his wife, Rebbetzin Vigler, kind of deconstruct the show and, as they say, attempt to fact-check it. And I think mostly just clarify certain questions that people had or make changes to some of the narratives or viewpoints that were portrayed in the show. And I was immediately intrigued when I clicked on it because, as I said, I was still in the community when the show aired in the first place. So I was able to watch it about a year before I left. And at that point, I had decided that I was going to leave. So that really was not a question in my mind. But it was the first piece of media I saw that portrayed the leaving process. And I remember thinking to myself, even at that time, that it really upset me. The way that the community was portrayed, and also the way that the process of leaving was portrayed in the first place. With that in mind, the way that I kind of want to go about filming this is I want to tell you what my thoughts were on the short series. And then we're going to get into some of the things that were said in Rabbi and Rebbetzin Vigler's video that I wanted to respond to. And so before we do that, I do just want to set a quick intention of this isn't really me like trying to come at anyone or start an argument. I'm a big believer in dialogue. I think that especially in kind of contentious conversations like this, it's really important that people just talk to each other. I think that there is a propensity to talk over another person when they feel attacked by something, even if something is not necessarily an attack or if it's not meant to be an attack. And my goal always is to put conversation and dialogue first, and to create a platform where people feel safe enough to respond back and say, hey, well, maybe I disagree with this. And we can talk about it and have a conversation, because I think that talking and conversing and sometimes arguing is really how we grow and we learn about each other, and we can get somewhere in a productive fashion. So, with that intention, let's get into what did I think when I watched Unorthodox. I want to break this down into two parts, which is that I felt a certain type of way about the way that the community was portrayed in the show, and I felt a certain type of way about how the OTD story was portrayed in the show. And just to maybe go in some chronological order here, I'll just talk about how I felt about the way that the Frum community was portrayed in the show. And I think that this is something that me and Rebbetzin pretty firmly agreed on, which is that in Unorthodox, the lack of depth and character building when it came to the different community members that were shown on screen was kind of upsetting. Rebbetzin says that they felt like wooden stick figures. They didn't feel human. Like, it felt like they were caricatures of something that were being used to further the story along. But, that these people did not have interiorities, did not have personal feelings or experiences of their own. And I think that there's a couple of things going on here. And I'm going to speak from some personal experience after speaking to folks involved in some of this OTD, ex-Orthodox media. But in my personal opinion, I think that this was done with purpose. I don't think that it was an accident or for a lack of there being enough screen time to get into it. I think that when a director or a writer fails to give characters a proper story or background, that can usually give you the sense that those characters are not meant to be seen as having that same level of interiority, because they are being used to further somebody else's plot line. Sometimes that is okay. That's something that is often used in this medium. But when you are talking about a community like this, and you build out the stories and the lives of people in the secular world, but you fail to do that, and you characterize everyone in the Orthodox world, except maybe for SD and her mother, the OTD people in the series, that kind of indicates to me that you feel a certain type of way about that, about those people and about that community. Orthodox Jews are human beings. We have a whole variety of different experiences. Our family lives look different from one another. We have different personalities and different ways of viewing things, and different hardships and different blessings in our lives. And I think that it was a massive failure that this really was not portrayed very well in Unorthodox. And I do think that it went to further a certain kind of narrative of the community that perhaps all Orthodox Jews are sort of just sheep, mindlessly following some kind of shepherd, aka the rabbi or the rabbanim of the community. Nobody thinks for themselves. Nobody has an interior life. Everything is maybe written on their sleeve. This is just not true to reality. Our families, the communities that we come from, they're people. just like everyone else. Being from a community like this does not make you a different kind of person with a different sort of social makeup. You know, they have secrets, they have feelings, they have experiences, um, and they're varied and vast, and they make us who we are. And I think, I just think that that was a really glaring mistake made on the part of the folks that, you know, went into produce, direct, and write the series. And then the other side of that is the way in which that the OTD story was portrayed. The first time I watched it, before I left, I was upset by it because it didn't feel realistic to me. I had known people who had gone OTD before. And from my perspective, like, that is just something that never happened. No one leaves with the clothing on their back. And I mean, just the fact that she went to a different country is kind of an aside. Let's say she just moved to a new city, right? The clothing on your back, you have nothing, you really know no one. The idea that she, within 24 hours, could meet an entire community of people who was surrounding her, materially wanting to help her. She got to audition for a world renowned music school, literally all within 1 week of her having left. At that point, when I had watched it, I thought to myself, this doesn't feel realistic. A year later, when I left, I didn't realize how true to life that would be, how fully unrealistic and frankly disrespectful I found that storytelling to be. The material reality for a lot of folks leaving the community can look very different depending on which community you left. If you're leaving a very stringent Hasidic sect like Satmar, some folks don't have the best grasp on English. There were definitely cases, more so in the past, of people who really didn't know how to speak the language very well. That's not so much the case today, although I'm sure there are cases of that happening. I'm not here to make blanket statements. But really, some of the biggest issues are that, you know, some of them don't really have credit scores, so they can't get an apartment. They don't have a lot of prior work experience, so trying to get a job outside of the community can be very difficult. And most of them do not have a high school education. They don't have a high school diploma. So trying to get into college, already there's a barrier there. You have to get your GED first, and then you can get into college. But how do you get a GED if you don't have a very good grasp on the mother tongue of your country? You don't have a very good you don't have a very good grasp on STEM, like sciences and maths. It's just complicated. And for some of these less stringent communities, you know, you might have a high school diploma and you might have some work experience. So some of those more material needs might be a little more easily met. But then you also have the emotional aspect of, I don't have a community anymore. I don't have my family. I don't have friends. I don't have loved ones. There is a lot of shame and guilt that goes into leaving all that you've ever known and all that you've ever been taught was right. And, you know, a lot of people I know have gotten hooked on drugs. A lot of people fall into sex work as a means of survival. It is just a very turbulent transition into the secular world for a lot of people. And maybe that is not the case for all. Like I said, not here to make blanket statements, but that is true for a lot of OTD people in my experience, having spoken to so many of them and been in community with so many of them. So to see this very sensational story of this girl who essentially leaves a cult, you know, like I said before, kind of a baby bird out of a cage situation, and she comes into the secular world which is so inviting and beautiful. And, it almost feels like the grass is greener, the sky is bluer, and all of these people who have these, vast variety of experiences and interiorities, like deep interiorities, suddenly they want to invite you into their world. They want to love you and accept you for who you are and build you up as a person. Could not be further from the truth. That just does not happen to someone, not within the first week of them leaving. Leaving and deconstructing all of those hard feelings can take people years. Some folks have been out 10, 15 years and they are still not there yet. So no, I did not appreciate the dishonesty with which Unorthodox was told. And I think that in Rabbi and Rebbetzin Vigler's response video, they were sort of responding to a lot of the religious and cultural things that they found some flaws with, mostly in the beginning, like in the story of SDs growing up in the Satmar community. And I found some issues with that too, although I think I would like to correct some of what the Rabbi and Rebbetzin said and maybe add a perspective that, maybe they hadn't heard of or thought about, and just sort of open that place to discuss a little bit. So I think we're going to get into the latter part of this episode and start talking a little bit about the response video. So the first two things that I kind of want to address in order is Rebbetzin Chana makes the point that SD's background within the community is very unique, and therefore the Hasidic community is not the story being told, it is the background for SD's story to be told. And I kind of want to answer that in parts. SD did have a very outwardly unique story. She was essentially orphaned, right? Her mother comes from a different country. She's from Manchester. She comes to Williamsburg, and she gets married to a man who is a drunk and is not good to her or her daughter. And she also, SB's mother, also happens to be a lesbian. So that kind of adds another layer of difficulty there. SD's mother leaves her husband. They kind of move into an apartment together. And then eventually, the community successfully takes SD away from her mother, and her mother leaves and builds a life of her own, and SD is raised by her grandparents. One thing that I want to say about this is that for a lot of OTD folks, especially those who were married and had children in the community, I was not married and I did not have kids. I left before that could happen because I knew that life would get a million times more difficult for me if I tried to leave after that had occurred. So I left. But not a lot of people either knew that they wanted to leave at that point or felt that they could. So some folks, like SD's mother and like real life people who have told their stories, stayed. And sometimes they had, 1, 2, 3, 7, 10 kids before they left. And the story of these women leaving and having their babies taken away from them is not an uncommon story that happens to a lot of women who leave the community. And it is heartbreaking. And I often say that the only OTD story in Unorthodox that I felt was truly authentic in some way or fashion was the story of SD's mother. And I often wish that we had focused a little bit more on that story within the series. I think that would have hit really close to home for a lot of people. But um, in any case, SD has this really complicated backstory, and the Rebbetzin is correct. Not a lot of people have an outwardly dysfunctional family unit. And she goes on to say that, this is probably a very big reason for why she left and why she found it so difficult to remain in the community. And I don't like the assertion that 90 or 99% of Satmar or Frum homes in general are not dysfunctional simply because they have a father, a mother, and who knows how many kids. The inside of those homes can be and are dysfunctional for a lot of folks. Mommy and daddy could be fighting every night over money or about their marriage. There could be abuse going on inside the home. Maybe one of them is a functioning alcoholic. Maybe some of the kids are having some difficulties. There are some behavioral issues going on. Maybe some mental health issues happening within the home that is making home life difficult, that is causing dysfunction, because this is not really a result of living in the Satmar or Frum community. This is just a result of being a human being. This goes on in all cultures and all communities. It is not unique to Frum people in the same way that being functional and being healthy is somehow unique to Frum people. You can point to lower divorce rates, you can point to this, you can point to that. Everyone, every culture, every community has dysfunction within its walls. I don't necessarily think SD was more dysfunctional or put at worse odds because she came from a place of outward dysfunction. And there are plenty of people who have left the community that came from very nice homes, very wealthy homes in certain cases. And I think that kind of leads me to just want to say that just because someone leaves because they are finding difficulty remaining in the community, they're finding difficulty with some of the traditions and some of the culture associated with that Judaism that they were raised with, just because that is happening, that does not then mean that their story is not reflective or indicative of a specific kind of Frum story or a specific kind of Hasidic story. It's not to say, well, oh, you had these feelings and these experiences, and that's not really Hasidic in nature. That's just yours. That is for you to own. In my opinion, that kind of takes away the responsibility of family, friends, and community to say, what is it about these things that some people are struggling with? What is it about these things that we could change or improve on? And that doesn't mean getting rid of something. That it literally just means, how can we be better in X, Y, and Z regard? I don't think SD's story is a secular story. I think that OTD people and Frum people are one and the same. We are each other's family, friends, loved ones, the mothers or fathers of each other's children. We are each other's communities, and we ought to still take care of one another and have empathy for one another. And so I do want to push back a little bit on that narrative. The next point that I kind of want to bring up is that the Rebbetzin and Rabbi in this video start talking about how it's kind of bizarre that Yanki's immediate reaction to everything is to talk to his wife or to talk to his mother and his father and his rabbi about what to do. And I don't think that this is unrealistic, especially just like from my own experiences growing up and from speaking to other people who have been in similar circumstances. It is not weird. And I don't think you could even pass judgment for someone who is so young. 20, 21, 22. That is young, especially when you come from a much more sheltered environment, one where you don't have past experiences of being in a romantic relationship. Obviously, if your wife, who you just recently had a fight with about getting a divorce because she supposedly couldn't get pregnant, if she just disappears in the middle of the night and you don't know where she went, your first instinct is going to be either running to your parents' house to ask them for advice or speaking to your rabbi, who is really like the center of your spirituality in so many ways. He is a sage, he is wiser than you are. And, that's why we have rabbis. That is why we have spiritual leaders. It's what they're there for. I am certainly not passing judgment on Yankee for that being his initial instinct. It's just not the case that something like that happens and then he kind of just shrugs his shoulders and says, okay, well, I guess I'm going to deal with this on my own, and I'm going to think fully independently and fully of myself. If that had happened to me, I definitely think that the first place I was going to run to would be to my dad. And be like, this is uncharted territory, and I certainly never saw this happen to you and mom, and you're a lot older than me, so what should I do about this? I just thought that was kind of like an interesting thing to push back on in the story, because to me it just felt like one of the more realistic parts of the community. Like, you have this safety net around you for a reason, and people should be able to use that without judgment. Another point that I kind of want to bring up, and this really just goes to this theme here of not putting everyone in the same box, not fitting everyone in the same narrative, which is that just because some folks in the Frum community find a lot of meaning in minhagim, in the traditions of their culture, that doesn't mean that there aren't other people who don't struggle tremendously with some of them. And that doesn't make them bad. That doesn't make them abnormal. And it doesn't even make them unique. A lot of people struggle with some of the harder parts of living such a stringent life. Some people don't. Some people really like those aspects of their life, right? Because we are not a monolith, like you said. We are people with a lot of different feelings and experiences of things. And sometimes a lot of that maybe is the way that things are framed to you as a child and as an adult. But sometimes it's just, I don't want to shave my head when I get married, right? That was also one of the more realistic aspects of the show. Was she did cry and struggled tremendously when she shaved her hair off. And again, I think each scene was deliberate. I think everything wanted to fit a certain kind of narrative. I'm not going to argue about that. I already, explained how I felt about the show in the beginning, but this specific part of it is really not the case that people just kind of shrug their shoulders and they say, okay, well, this is just what we've always done. Or if, they don't want to do it, they just won't do it. Again, sometimes that is the case. Sometimes people will just say, I didn't want to do that. My husband really didn't want me to do that either. So we just don't do it, and that's okay. And, some people have that experience. Again, we're people, even in the Frum community, if something can be done in private and kept a secret, that's what's going to happen. Common, just like a human experience. But there have also been many stories of the fact that, it's not really true that just because you are a married woman, the only person that's ever going to see your head again is your husband, unless you want some other woman to see it. There is also the mikvah where people have to be undressed in front of another person and take their head covering off. There have been stories of women who did not want to shave their head in certain communities. And there were some consequences for that for them. Is this true in all communities? No. Is this true for every person? No. And some of these stringencies and difficulties can be put upon them as the person doing it because that's what their mother did and that's what they feel is right and that they have to do, even if it's tremendously difficult for them. It's really not one of those things that, oh, I'm just going to pick and choose this. I'm going to kind of go through the cafeteria and just do what I want with this and not do that. It's a little more complicated than that. And I don't think, again, that it has to be either one way or the other way. I think that there is nuance. And I do want to validate the feelings and experiences of people who did not have such good experiences, especially with this specific area of Satmar culture and tradition. So the latter part of this conversation, I'm going to be talking a little bit about the parts of the series that talked about sex and sexuality and birth control and having children in the community. And so I think I kind of want to start, let's just do this chronologically. Let's just start with how the community or how the show portrays sex within the community, how that works for people after they get married. I found it kind of interesting that the Rabbi and Rebbetzin really struggled with this part. There were some things said that I was like, for tznius reasons, did you both watch the whole thing through? Because there were some corrections made and some things said that I was like, that was addressed actually like in the moment within the series itself. And we're going to touch on that in a little bit. Again, this is kind of dependent on which community you come from. And it's not, if you come from this community, you had sex education, and if you come from that community, you didn't. This is a sliding scale, and every community within, or every family within the community is also going to be on a sliding scale, right? So some people are going to have more, some people are going to have less. In any case, within Satmar, and in a lot of these more stringent Hasidic sects, a lot of these men and women are not learning about sex until the day before they get married. Sometimes the day of. Some people, namely, this is more common with women, aren't learning about what their genitals do or what they look like. And I'll just share a story personally. When I was 16 years old and at a sleepover, a friend of mine said to me, I don't have any pads. Do you have a pad? And I said, oh, no, but I do have a tampon. And she looked at me and she was like, what's a tampon? So I had to explain what that was. And then she asked, where does it go? And so I kind of broke down anatomy for her. And she had never heard of this before. And kind of said, okay, what is it for? Like, why do you have those parts of your anatomy? And then, I kind of explained to her, this is how you have babies, and this is what makes a baby. And she was horrified. I think in that moment, she felt a little stunned, maybe a little traumatized. And eventually, like, she got over it, and I think she's probably happy that that conversation happened right before her wedding. um, but she was 16 years old, and most of her friends that she was hanging out with probably either wouldn't have wanted to have that conversation in the first place. It's not uncommon at all. And I didn't grow up in a Satmar community. My community was not nearly as stringent. So for that to be happening where I grew up, how much more so is that happening in the Satmar community? And when you prevent people from learning about their bodies and you tell them what is about to happen to them, literally within sometimes days or hours of it happening, you can't expect them to fully accept that emotionally, physically, or psychologically. A lot of women, a lot of women from these communities will suffer from something called vaginismus, which is both a physical and psychological condition that kind of constricts the muscles of the vaginal wall and makes it very difficult to have pain-free sex. And so, yes, these women will struggle sometimes for months, sometimes over a year, if not more, with having penetrative sex. SD kind of goes through that. Her Kala teacher gives her a set of dilators to use when she goes and asks for help, because she does eventually go and ask for help. But even then, that's not terribly helpful because she's not dealing with the psychology of why she felt that way. And, again, there are two sides to why that condition manifests in the first place. And then you have men who, again, like Rabbi Vigler talks about in Judaism, there is this tradition of if a man cannot provide for his wife in bed, she has a right to divorce him. And there is a tradition of talking about how does a man do that? How does a man provide for his wife in bed? However, just because that is true of Judaism, just because Judaism safeguards women in this way, does not always mean this translates terribly well into culture. And I think that that has very much been the case in some of these more insular Hasidic groups, is that culture has really triumphed in this area. And so, Yankee or a husband or whatever is kind of looking at that and saying, okay, well, what does it mean? Like, well, what even is foreplay? Like, how do you even do that? So there is this difficulty for both parties. However, women, because they are on the receiving end of that, I think struggle with it very tremendously. So it is not uncommon or unrealistic to suggest that it would take months for SD to be able to get to that place, even after asking for help. Again, I think it's interesting that the Rebbetzin says, oh, well, watching that, it kind of felt like he raped her. And just from a media perspective, from a perspective of filmmaking, you were supposed to feel that way, not because that's what necessarily happened, but because that is what SD was feeling. SD felt like she had no control. SD felt like she didn't want it this way. And so what you were feeling was with purpose. And I don't think, I'm not going to speak to what that was suggesting necessarily, whether that was suggesting that it's always like this. But for a lot of women, it can often feel like, I am not ready for this, I am not comfortable with this, and I'm physically like in pain. And this kind of goes back to, this is what happens when a community lacks real significant sex education. And obviously, like, I was very happy and pleased to hear that both the Rabbi and Rebbetzin said that they speak to their children personally at an age-appropriate level, what sex is, where babies come from. That's really vital information to give to your children. It safeguards against sexual violence and sexual abuse. And it prepares them for that next stage in their lives that they're going to take in about, 10, 15 years or whatever. A lot of frum kids aren't getting that same privilege, and that is a real privilege. And so, again, I don't think that that's something that needed to be fact checked or corrected. That is just happening to some folks. And instead of it making us maybe feel a little bit upset, we should look at ourselves and say, okay, what can we do to change this culture? What can we do to make it so that women do not feel like this on the night of their wedding? And just to bounce from that, talking a little bit about birth control and having kids, I don't think I have ever met an OTD mother who has said, I regret having the children that I had in the community. I regret having kids. I wish I'd never had kids. You're saying that, and I'm saying that. I don't think I've ever met someone who has said that to me. However, sometimes people will say, I wish that I could have waited longer between children. I wish that my body had been allowed to heal longer. I wish that I had psychologically been allowed the room to heal, because in some communities, some Rabbanim are a little bit more lenient about the birth control thing. They will give allowances for that birth control for longer periods of time. In some communities, like Chabad has really taken off with mental health in the last 10 years in a way that a lot of other Hasidic communities simply have not. And so, in Chabad, if someone says, I cannot psychologically have another child right now, okay, so there's a lot more likelihood that that person is probably going to get an allowance for a longer time to use birth control. But in some of these other communities, that might not be the case. That might not even be the case in Chabad for another person. Just to, everyone's experience of this is very different. But it is absolutely true that some women, after asking for an allowance, were not allowed one, despite not being ready to have another child in that moment, which again can feel like a loss of control, a loss of autonomy, and it can be very psychologically draining. Having a baby is very, very difficult on the body and on the spirit and on the mind. And while children are the most important things in the world and they are beautiful gifts from God, a lot goes into bringing them into the world. And so it's important to make room and to listen to the concerns of mothers who had, difficulties with that in the community. So I think that is all that I had put down in my notes that I wanted to touch on. I'm sure maybe there are some points that I missed. If you watched the video and you saw some stuff that you would like to point out and talk about, you should definitely reach out, make a comment on YouTube, and we can talk about it. But yeah, I kind of just want to reiterate that really my point in doing this and doing all of this is we are each other's family, friends, loved ones, etc. We come from the same communities, and historically there's been a lot of tension there. Relationships have been quite fraught, and that is still the case for a lot of people. And I believe in retaining strong families, strong Jewish families. I believe in love and respect and happy dynamics for both sides. And I think that the only way we are going to get there is if we talk to each other. That's why I work so hard to continue keeping that line of communication open. And if I thought that everything in the community was bad, and I hadn't worked through some of my own hardships and some of my own difficult experiences while being in the community, I wouldn't be the voice that I am today, and I wouldn't be able to make such a platform in the way that I am right now. And so, with that, I think we're going to go ahead and sign off. So, thank you for listening or watching. If you could please like and subscribe and leave a comment if you are with us on YouTube. It would very much be appreciated. I really would love if other folks experiencing some of the same things could scroll by this on their algorithm and feel that sense of community. So, with that, goodbye.